Welcome back, Liberty, and we are so glad you decided to join us. My name is Ken McLemore, and I serve as the missions pastor here.
I'm Jonathan DeMonch, local missions pastor at the Hampton campus.
And we are glad you came back. We're continuing on the idea of talking to agnostics who say, basically, Jonathan, what? There may be a God, there may not be a God. I just
Yeah,
can't prove it, and I don't know.
that's right. And also atheists who
Yeah,
think that there's not a God at all.
there's not a God.
Yeah, and
Provable.
practical atheism too, right? We
Practical
talked about
atheism.
that.
Yeah, we did. That's people
Yeah,
who basically might even say they're Christians, but they live their lives as if there is no God.
yeah, yeah.
And so we want to talk about that day. We've already talked a little bit about, and again, let us rephrase this, or not rephrase it, but restate it. We want to let you know we are no experts. We're not doctors. We're not here to get in an argument with anybody. These are just some things that I personally went through in my own life when I was doubting that God's existence, and I began to study this through high school and college and on into my seminary career in life that I wanted to study about apologetics. How do I know God exists? How do I know all that? So it kind of came out of that in my life. And last week we went over evolution, the idea that can life begin on planet Earth? In other words, by itself.
Yeah.
In other words, can we go from just matter, dead matter, and have human life that can think and move and walk and all that kind of stuff? And I believe that we can't get there like that.
Nope.
It's called abiogenesis or spontaneous generation. And I think that personally that's been proven it couldn't happen. Nowhere have they been able to test tube it. In other words, do it in a scientific laboratory. To their credit, they would say, well, we haven't had the trillions of chances that you would have had over all these years, and therefore, but nothing that we've seen so far, and nothing I've read, even leads to the idea that you can get intelligent life out of nothing.
Not even close.
Yeah, it's crazy. And even if you think about it logically, to me, it's kind of crazy. Just to think that we talked about it last week, how intricate the eyeball is, or how intricate the brain is, and how it can reason and think, and that grew out of nothing. And the illustration we gave last week was an explosion in a junkyard creates a BMW. You can imagine, boy, if that's the case, I'm going to go around blowing up junkyards. Hopefully, I'll get me a 4x4 with big old tires, and I can go driving on the beach or something like that. That'd be kind of fun, but you can't get there. This week we want to, and we also talked about the fossil record.
Right.
If evolution's true, then where's the missing link? Which there hasn't been found a single missing link yet. There's some that say, okay, this leans towards it, but if you think about it, to me, just trying to think through this reasonably, um, you know, it would be millions of them. There would be millions of ape to men fossils that were obvious, but there's not. Or there would be millions of fish to snakes that claim on the land, or something that could walk on the land that would be, how did it come out of the ocean? There's nothing.
Right.
And so I want to start focusing today, though, and talking to agnostics and people that don't believe that God exists. I want to start talking today about another thing that I use in talking to them, and that's the idea of where do morals come from. Jonathan, I'll never forget this. When I was in seminary, I was I was a lay person in charge of a large singles group at my church. And we had a great singles group. We had lots of fun, going out. So one day a visitor comes in, and we were great at contacting them, just loving on them and stuff like that. And a guy named John came in, and I remember John very well. And John was very honest with me. I love this. Just be honest. If you're a Christian, say you're a Christian. If you're an atheist, say you're an atheist. And he says, I'm an atheist. I said, great. I'm glad you're here, man. Let's get to know. So we kind of started getting to know each other. He was the nicest guy. Now, if you think that just because somebody says they're an atheist or they're immoral, that doesn't mean they're not nice. There's a lot of Christians that aren't so nice.
Right.
But he was incredibly nice. And after a while, he and I just got to know each other. We exchanged phone numbers. We got to talking. And of course, it's going to lead to, why are you here? And it was really funny. He said, I want to find a very moral wife. And so he thought, what better place to find a moral wife than is at a church in a big singles group? And I just laughed. I said, man, I didn't know what to say.
I don't know what to say.
I don't know what to say either, but I thought it was interesting that among his own tribe, he wasn't finding what he was looking for. And that doesn't mean that people that are atheists are immoral. It doesn't mean that. But what it means is this: where do your morals come from? Because if there is no God, and in my discussions with people, that's what I ask: if there is no God, then where do morals come from? And several things that I heard, like John said this, he said it's biological. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
And it's in our biology.
Yeah. Basically, as a form of evolution to stay alive, since since human beings are tribal,
Right?
we've decided among a few different rules that we would all abide by to help the chances of us staying alive.
Yeah, but it's also that it's in my moral code that I shouldn't kill somebody. You know, and it plays off what you just said.
Right.
You know, because for the human race to survive. But you know what's I find it so interesting. Here's one thing I got is from a resource that says how do they determine their morals, and it's basically the ability. In other words, where do our ethical behaviors come from? And in humans, it's the ability to anticipate the consequences of one's actions. It's kind of like what you just said. And then the ability to make value judgments, and then the ability to choose between alternative courses of action. So, just like we did in the last series, I'm going to my friend, ChatGPT, and I asked him, where do morals come from? Where does an atheist derive its morals? And here's what it said. It said, an atheist can derive their moral values and ethics from various sources, including human reasoning and experience, empathy and compassion, societal norms and cultural traditions, scientific understanding of human behavior, and personal philosophical beliefs. Then it said this, ultimately, the sources of moral values and ethics for an atheist, like for any individual, are influenced by a combination of individual experiences, cultural and society factors, and personal beliefs. But here's the question. That still doesn't mean I have to obey something. In other words, if you say, I don't want to kill somebody because I just don't, that's just not who I am. But another
It's
guy
against your
says,
conscience.
and then you got to ask, where does the conscience come from? You know, but then another guy says, well, man, I'm a psychopath. I love killing people. that's an extreme example. I get that, but we try to provide extreme examples to kind of show that I can't realistically tell him that that's wrong. And what would I base that on? Now, for you and I, we would say God says, "Thou shalt not kill."
Right.
You shall not premeditatively murder somebody. That's different than serving in the military and fighting a war. That's different. But if you look at the Hebrew word, that means premeditatively go out and just murder somebody for no reason. That's wrong because God says it's wrong. It's against God's character to murder. He does not murder, and therefore it's against his character. So we would say that. And an atheist would say, I don't want to murder, and we agree. You don't. An atheist, they don't want to murder people. That's not who they are. But I would say, but where does that morality come from? And as you start going down the line, you start saying, what about different things in society of ethics? So,
Yeah.
for example, for the longest time, we had a Christian base here that said it's wrong to have homosexual relations with the same sex, right? But if there is no God, why is that wrong? And that's where we're kind of heading. And if you look in our culture, it's heading, and I don't even want to say this a whole lot, but it's an example of, if you're not watching out there, it's even happening with, I want to phrase this gently, with kids, with the abuse of kids. And it's even becoming more out in the open and acceptable. And you know, that's the way it started with homosexuality, that it's okay, that it's not okay in our society. And then all of a sudden it's okay. And guys, when we get rid of God, we get rid of cultural norms that were based upon the Bible back in the day, which I believe America had as its foundation, biblical basis for morality. So when we jettison the Bible, where do those moral values come from? I'll never forget when I worked at the YMCA. I was a tennis and fitness instructor in my last year or so of seminary, and then of course coming out. And a gentleman and I were talking one time, and we were talking about this. He was an agnostic guy, and he was a great guy. I liked him. We were friends, and we could just have great, friendly conversations, which you're going to hear that throughout all of this. And I said, so where do our morals come from? And he said, well, society. And so basically what he was saying was, either if you're a democracy, it's the 50.1% of the vote, then that's what's moral. That what gets voted in is okay. So in that sense, you know, we voted in some things that are crazy, like abortion and different things like that. that it's okay to kill babies because the 51% voted on it. And then he said, well, our society or whatever government you had. And I just looked at him and I said, so Hitler wasn't wrong. And Jonathan, he just looked at me with a stunned look and he goes, I got to go work out. He left. He goes, I don't have an answer. And he just walked off. And I'm like, yeah, Hitler, Stalin, none of them were actually wrong if they were actually in power and they were the government. It kind of reminds me of the video you sent me the other day. And share a little bit about that video.
Sure. Basically, these two guys talking, and one gentleman was sharing how because of the greater good that was going on in a particular society, this person ended up being a great ruler. He considered him to be a great ruler. And then he said, well, what about the thousands and the millions of people that he killed? And he said, hey, let's not get off topic here. Let's talk about some of the good things. But in a Christian worldview, you can't negate that.
Yeah, and basically it was Stalin and Mao and all them.
Yeah.
We can say that. It was they killed millions and millions of people, and this guy was basically saying, it's okay.
Yeah.
It was for the greater good.
Right.
You know, because look what Stalin did for his culture. And having lived in Russia, I can tell you of the harms that he did when I heard from senior adults who had been through that time as kids and things like that, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, when you get to a point when you jettison God, then you might say, yes, I have a moral foundation, but I have no reason to really have that moral foundation other than just more people voted for it than against it. And my question is, at what point do you draw the line? Where do you stop drawing the line? If you don't stop the line here, and you can't appeal to some higher authority, then the line gets continually moved downward and downward and downward until you have a total chaos for society, and all that we can hope for at that point is a great revival. If you listen to a sermon, which I think is very fascinating, it's by Dr. J. Edwin Orr, who's passed away, and this is a very, very old sermon. It was in 1977. It was given for Campus Crusade for Christ, which of course is now Cru, and it was given in Dallas, Texas, and actually the topic was prayer. And it talked about America, even in the 1700s and 1800s. And, you know, we have this view, Jonathan, that America was just this little, great little holy land, that there was no... That's not the way it was, because he was talking about at Harvard and Yale, where in the student body they couldn't find one believer. And it was at a period in America's history when there was such a need. And when they came out west to Kentucky, he talked about how the lawlessness and the ruthlessness was rampant, because they had jettisoned God in their lives. And the only answer that saved America were the great revivals of the 1790s, the great revivals of 1804. If you go into the New York revival in 1857, and he talked about how through that revival, people turned back to God and our morality moved back up the chart. And we're, you know, and I think we're heading in that time of history. So if you're talking to agnostics and atheists, I would talk about what is the basis of your morals. And even if the law says that, why do I have to obey that? There is no God. There's no one to hold me responsible. Why not cheat on my wife? Why not leave my family? If there is no God and I'm going to just die and go to the dust, I can do whatever I want and whatever I feel like.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's foolishness of them to appeal to some kind of morality.
Yeah, Ken, it reminds me of a scripture verse, Romans 2, verse 14 and 15. Indeed, when the Gentiles who did not have the law do by nature what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. So they show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, and their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts either accusing or defending them.
Yeah, that's good. Man, that's real good, because even the idea that there is, I think agnostics, I think they do have a moral code. I think it is, like you just said, it's written there.
On our hearts.
But it was put there by God and designed into our basic, you know, who we are in a conscious, because we are not just a clump of cells. We're body and we are spirit. I mean, so we are we are body and soul. And so we do have something in there, but that's put there. Yeah. And to me, that's, you know, you bring up a good point, is where in the world does consciousness come from? I mean, reason. Why is there, if we are just a chance happening of a clump of cells, then how can we even trust that reason is actually right?
Right.
I mean, that's crazy to me. I love the idea of you can never know what a straight line is if you don't first have a straight line. So if you could have a line that looks like this and call it straight, but if you don't have something to compare it with to say this is straight,
Yeah.
well, this one's not then.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the idea behind this. If there is no God to say this is morality, your straight line, then we have nothing which to weigh it against to say we're outside of morality.
Yeah. And everything is relative.
And everything's relative. So your truth is not my truth. I hear that so much. You know, it's your own truth. Well, no, wait a minute. Something's either true or it's not.
Right.
And so that's the case. So I think that's a good path to go down in talking to people. And I think it's a good way when I think a practical explanation of that is that when you're talking to your students or your kids or whoever, when you're teaching them, you can teach them that the foundation of everything of morality is based upon God. And so I had a little exercise with some people I know, and we were talking about a topic. I'm not going to mention it on here, but they said, well, why do you choose to do that? And they said, well, it's not ethical. And so I began to push them on where does that ethic come from? And they really couldn't answer. It's like, where does that come from, though? You say that's ethical, and what I'm doing is unethical. Where do you get that? And they really couldn't find it. They had no basis to say that what they were choosing to do was ethical.
Yeah.
But they had no basis to say what I was choosing to do was unethical. So I think it's fun. You've got to look at those foundations, and I want us to start thinking in that way so that you can just sit and have a nice discussion with people. And you know what? Going back to my example of John, we had some great discussions through my time. And man, I remember us one night, I had a final the next day, but he was so close to becoming a believer. I spent 3 hours on the phone with him, and instead of studying. Now, it took up a lot of time, but it was worth it to me to say, if I can talk to this guy and he becomes a believer, that's great. And you know what? I will tell you that in the time that I knew John, he never became a believer. And I don't know where he is today. We never kept in touch after I left and
Hopefully
came
he
to Virginia.
sees this video.
Yeah, maybe he sees this video and become a believer. I want to step into another area, though. Right now, I want to step into another area which I think is evidence of God existing, and that's the area of design.
Yeah.
And to me, Jonathan, I think if we look on this planet, design is everywhere.
Yeah.
You don't look at a building and go, that just happened. And they say, well, of course it didn't just happen. But the complexities of just a building, like your house, which is not complex. I mean, I can tear it apart and it's basically wood and electrical wiring and plumbing. Shingles, it's not that complex.
Yeah.
But it couldn't come about without somebody designing it. You know, I've noticed, Jonathan, too. I love to listen to podcasts, and I listen to some different guys, and this is actually a Bitcoin podcast. I'm kind of fascinated with that, and so I've been looking at that. But it was interesting because the guy doesn't believe he believes in evolution, but then as he began to talk, he talked about the design. And I thought, do you hear yourself talking about, and he wasn't talking about the evolution of Bitcoin, he was talking about evolution of man, how it relates to some things, and it's more of a philosophical discussion. But then he talked about the design of how they designed this and this, and I thought, do you hear yourself contradicting yourself?
Right.
Something came from nothing, man, but yet this has to be designed, And here's the thing I like to talk to people about. When they say evolution came about, look at the computer. That is an incredible design.
It's a nice piece of work.
It's a nice piece of work, that little bitty thin thing and what it can do. But it took 50 years of designing, or more than that. It took 50 years of designing to get it, and it's not even near as complex as the human brain. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
So
We're going to human cell.
Or a human cell. Very good point. Just one cell is more complex in the way it's put together than that whole computer. And Jonathan, that's what I think about. Sometimes, even lately, I've got into the thought like, God, where are you? You kind of think sometimes, where's God? And then you think, how can you hear my voice? There's 8 billion people on the planet. How can you hear my voice? And then here's what God kind of echoed back into my brain. He says, Kenny, if you can go on the internet and you can talk to people all around the world like I just did this morning on this little thing that y'all invented, and this thing can do billions of calculations per second. He goes, and I invented all of this? Do you not think that I can hear your voice? Wow.
Wow, that's amazing.
That was a great thing for me. Jonathan, let's go to our
amazing.
friend, the supercomputer ChatGPT. And let's
Oh,
go.
another one of our designs.
Yes,
What did
another
you
one
say?
of
Yeah.
our designs. Yeah, it's an AI. And I said, what's an example of that? And of course, ChatGPT basically is its own design, which you just said, you know. And so you look at that, and it's its own design. It has a complexity beyond what we could ever say. So when everybody says we're just a bunch of random chances, I like to point to design and just say, no, we're all design, and we've got to look at that and think about that and go into those complexities and begin to talk to somebody about that.
Yeah. Even our morality, like, a lot of, like, we take that from, in part, the Imago Dei.
Yeah.
Like, being made in the image of God. So, therefore,
Great
we have
point.
value in our lives
Great
and in what we
point.
do. And a part of that is, like, our God likes to create, and we like to create. Granted, we can't create, something out of nothing.
Right, right.
But nonetheless, we take what it is we have here, and we create hardware and software and houses and all kinds of different things.
Yeah, and I think and you bring up a great point, and I didn't even think about. Yeah, God created us to be creators. We're created to be creators. And as I'm looking even in this studio we're recording this in, this is an incredible array of just creations.
Yeah.
The fact that I can speak into a microphone, we can record it on a chip, that's just design and extraordinary. So guys, I think it's good to look at it. We'll try to, I've got some books on design, even some professors. I remember years ago, a professor at Baylor even came out with a book on design, and there was a lot of controversy about that. He got some pushback on, how can you say that all this was designed? And I look at it and say, how can you not think it was designed? And if you go back to our session on evolution, where we were talking about where did life come from, not a lot, but some of the scientists I read, like Wald and Hoyle and Francis Crick and some of those guys, even some of their idea is that life came from another planet. But all that does is push it backwards. Okay, where did that life come from? Where did that life come from? And at some point when they say, oh, you just believe in God by faith, and I would turn around and say, you just believe in evolution by faith. Because it takes, to me, more faith to believe in evolution than it does to believe in God. And so that's just what I play. But Jonathan, I want to move into a little area. We've kind of hit upon it, and we've already kind of talked about it, but I want to talk about one of my heroes, about how he would talk to people in this realm. And his name is Dr. Francis Schaeffer. He passed away in 1984. And he had a ministry, and Christianity Today magazine named him the most influential Christian of the 20th century. And he actually went to school here in Virginia. He went to Hampden-Sydney, was an atheist agnostic. He became a believer. And what Francis Schaeffer did was he ended up being a missionary after the war over in Europe. And he ended up in Switzerland. And what would happen is his daughters would bring their friends home for the weekend, and they would sit and have discussions. And at that time, agnosticism, atheism was just on the increase big time. And so they would bring in, and they would just sit around in a room, and they would have discussions. And Francis Schaeffer would discuss with them, and he would just talk to them, and he would do this. He would take an idea, and his idea is this. You take people to the logical conclusion of their philosophy or their beliefs to show them the impossibility. So he did that actually with a young man named Udo Mittelmann, who was a German guy. And he was a lawyer, he was an intellectual. A lot of Francis Schaeffer's works are to intellectuals. If you ever get a chance to read some of his works, they're great. He's written 24 books, and they are great books. If you like to read, Escape from Reason is a great book. It's a slow read. It's a small book. He's got some others called True Spirituality. There's some movies he put out. Whatever Happened to the Human Race and things like that are really good. How Now Shall We Then Live is a great book, and also a video series. You can see that on YouTube. But he would take them to the logical end of the conclusion. He did that with Udo Mittelmann, and Udo ended up marrying his daughter and became his son-in-law. And I had the privilege, when I lived in Russia, Udo came for a series of lectures, and we were working with him. We were in a city there, and we worked. And Udo did a series of the Old Testament laws. I went brain dead. The Old Testament laws, how they apply and show that God exists. The Ten Commandments, how they show that God exists. And in the evenings, we would have discussion groups, much like Francis Schaeffer, his father-in-law, did in Europe.
Pretty cool.
And guys, I sat there in that group and I watched Udo lead a teacher, atheist, intellectual into understanding who God was and helping her at the end to say, of course, in Russian, she said, I can see that and I can believe that.
Wow.
And I sat there stunned. All this stuff I'd read about. So here's what Francis Schaeffer does. He talks to someone and he says, do it in love, do it with compassion, and he talks to them and takes them out to the logical end of their conclusion. So, for example, we already kind of did it, and we said, if God doesn't exist, where do morals come from? Okay. Well, if morals come from such and such, then why should I obey them? So if they say they come from society, kind of like I did with the guy, then you say, okay, then if society votes that everybody with brown hair has to go to jail, then that's okay. Well, everybody would say, no, that's crazy. But wait a minute, if there is no God, if there is no real basis of morality, and so you take them out to the logical end of their conclusion to help lead them to say that this is not a very good system of philosophy to believe in.
Correct.
Because that's what we're living out in America right now. We're living out the logical conclusion of getting rid of God. And the logical conclusion at the end of getting rid of God, something's got to fill that vacuum.
That's right.
And what fills that vacuum nowadays, mostly? It's
Atheism.
Well, it's really, if you think about it, it's whoever has the biggest stick, which in some countries is the local warlord. So he ends up just taking over and he becomes a dictator, right? Or it can be like in Russia, it was the government system, communism under Lenin and Stalin and then others, right? Or in America, we're seeing that happen where it's God versus government. So if God is being pushed out of our society, something's got to step in that place and it becomes government. Then whatever the government says takes over. So as you can see, you can take that idea of morality and you can say, well, what about this? Well, what about this? And what about this? And you keep marching down the path to say, everybody draws a line somewhere, but if there is no God, there is no line to really draw.
Correct.
I mean, it just comes down to the biggest guy can abuse the youngest person and they can take them over. And that's okay because there is no moral system ultimately. Now, we can set up a moral system, to help society. But does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. But at the end of the day, like, many people still don't, like, it's been proven that, like, a lot of times people still don't follow whatever moral systems that they try to establish in the first place.
That's true, and that goes for Christians too, doesn't
Yeah.
it? We don't always follow what we say is right,
That's true. Yeah.
So along those lines, I would encourage you, what are steps to doing this? Well, here's the steps. First off, you got to be friends. You've got to love them. Listen, guys, you're not going to win an argument, but you can help open the door to different things. I've already recommended this book to show how this happened with a guy in Islam. It's called Nabil Qureshi's Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, and it's a story of a 5-year process of a guy taking Nabil, and it's Nabil's the author, but he took Nabil through 5 years of just doing what you and I have been talking about. And so the first thing I would say is be friends with them, show love, mutual respect. If you don't do that, that's wrong. That is not Jesus, and that's wrong. Do not go into this, and I got to say this strongly, do not go into it as an argument. If it goes into an argument, you need to cut it off, and I've done that. I'm not going to argue with an atheist. I'm not. I'm going to say, if you want to have a sharing of ideas, and I'll look at yours like with John, my buddy, he told me, he said, biology determines our morality, and I said, where do you get that? I mean, he said, there's a book so-and-so. So I went looking for it in the library, and I called him back, and I said, man, I went to find the book. I couldn't find it. Can you tell me where I can find it? And he said, you went looking for it? I said, yeah, why not? He said, you were going to read the book I recommended. I said, you're a Christian. I said, I'll read the book. I don't care. And that just opened him up to say, you're willing to listen to me. And I am. I'm willing to listen and talk to you about what you believe. And so, first off, love, mutual respect. Then, again, going back to the Socratic methods, number 2, start to ask questions. Where is the missing link? Help me. Where is that transitional life form? What is the basis of agnostic morality? But if that's your basis, why do I have to obey it? Even if my biology says it, I don't have to obey what my biology says. I don't have to obey that. There's nothing that says I have to obey that, and that I've done something wrong. Now the state can throw me in jail for not obeying their laws, but that still doesn't mean we're both going to die. We're going to go into the dust, and it's over, and that's
right.
it.
Yeah.
So who cares? Um, all that kind of stuff. Listen to them. Do some of the research. Be a Berean. Go after it. Look at it. Don't argue with them. I would
don't be
say,
afraid.
don't argue with them.
Don't be afraid.
Oh, that's so good.
Just because you don't have all the answers, or just because they can maybe outwit you in an argument, or say something that leaves you stumped. Listen, our God is real, and we don't have anything to be afraid of. So keep digging, keep diving in. Maybe speak to a believer that may know a thing or two more than you,
Yeah.
or that can kind of help you with some of those points. And it's not about winning an argument. It's not about points. It's about just going down to the truth of what the matter is.
Yeah, Jonathan, that's so good. And I'm listening to you talk there, and I was thinking, there's a word, and we just need to be humble.
Yeah.
We need to be humble. That doesn't mean they're going to switch your view, but if somebody doesn't engage them, whether you're in high school, whether you're in college, or whether you're somewhere else and you're in the workforce, we've got to find a way to engage people like this. Don't argue with them. But at the end, like Francis Schaeffer used to do, he called it taking off the roof. And basically, that's taking off the roof to expose their ideas with walking through them to the end of their philosophy. And in the end, it leads to nothing. And so, you know what? Also, Jonathan, I would say give it time. Give it time. Talk to them. One of the things that I took off the roof, we've already mentioned, and I don't mean to keep harping on it, but if you look at what atheism has and agnosticism and getting rid of God has created around the world, when you look at Lenin, when you look at Stalin, as I heard those stories when I lived in Russia of people, how they were taken off to the gulag and how their grandparents disappeared and how the state put the hammer down on them. You can look at those ideas and say, this is the end of what's going on. And I've even had this conversation to be a little bit touchy on this kind of subject. It's like in a married couple, I've even talked to married guys and said, so if your wife cheats on you, is that wrong? Well, of course, he's going to get very mad. Why? Why? There's nothing that says that's wrong. And so that's where we're headed in our culture, especially on some of these topics that we're coming up with. And I would say to him, she's not a Christian. You're not a Christian. You have no real basis. You can agree not to have affairs, but if she does, then you have no real reason to say that's wrong, because there is no God. There's no one set in morality. Yeah. And you can divorce her. She can divorce you if you do it. But again, in the ultimate end, stuff like that. I had a pastor one time. I was went to First Baptist in Lubbock. I went to Texas Tech, and we had, back in the late 70s, guys, that does date me, but that's all right. We had an incredible college group, Jonathan. It was 1,200 students. They were the, how do I say this, precursor to young adult ministry. And we had our own service for just college students. We had our own pastor, worship leader. We had our own, almost like a little church. Not little, it was 1,200 people. And I remember the pastor there one time, his name was Barry Wood, and he came out of California, and he came out of the Jesus movement. And he came out of a movement that was really just dishing God, throwing him off. Now, there was Jesus movement also came out of that. But also there was the hippie movement that basically said no God exists and that communism was okay. So he was talking to a young man one time, and he was pretty young too. He was in his 20s. And the guy said, man, we share everything, and there's no God. We just live in harmony, and nothing's right and wrong. And so this young man had a guitar, and he just grabbed it and said, okay, I'll take this. And the guy looked at him and said, what do you mean you're taking that? And he said, well, you said we share everything, and there's no such thing as really God, so there's no such thing. Stealing is not wrong, so I'm just going to take this because I'm bigger than you. And the guy pitched a fit, and he said, he kind of got his point across. He said, if there's no God, then I'm bigger than you, I'm stronger than you, I can just take your stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so those are some areas that I would go down into. In wrapping up, Jonathan, here's what I would say is, first off, pray.
Yeah.
When you, I don't know if my mom prayed for her brother-in-law for 37 years before he became a believer. And we can't give up in praying for people. And by praying for our friends that are in this kind of arena, then I think the Holy Spirit's the only one that can get through. And you've got to let the Holy Spirit do its love. Talk to them with love, again, with love. with love. If find out why they believe the way they do. Like you said earlier, one of the reasons is they could have been deeply hurt.
That's
They
right.
could have lost a loved one and said, God, where are you? You know, if you're real, you wouldn't have taken my daughter or my son or my, you know, and stuff like that. Find out what prompted them to go in that direction. Ask questions. Listen to their beliefs. Do not be afraid of the answer. If you don't know the answer, it is okay to say, I don't know. I'll come back to you and we'll discuss it. And then read some of their stuff. I think, guys, it's okay. And then here's what I would say finally. We've got to ultimately, Jonathan, we've got to share the gospel.
Yeah.
We've got to say what we believe. We believe Jesus, yeah. Did Jesus die? Yeah, he did. Did he rise from the dead? That's why I believe in him, because he rose from the dead. And he's alive today. And that's what I tell all of them in different religions, of Mormonism or New Age movement. I would say, Jesus knows what's on the other side. He rose from the dead. He is the only one.
That's
and
right.
therefore, he can tell us for sure what was on the other side. And he proved that he was who he said he was by rising from the dead.
That reminds us in the scripture, Ken, you quoted it earlier on in the series, 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify in your hearts Christ as Lord, being ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason concerning the hope that is in you, yet with meekness and fear.
Ooh, I love that. I love
With
that.
meekness.
I love that.
With
So-
meekness and fear. Not with a Facebook post, but with meekness and fear.
And we don't care how many clicks a person gets. It doesn't change anybody's mind.
Right, right.
So-
So it also can, like, just, you know, some of the resources and folks, you've shared a couple of testimonies. Some other great testimonies and resources, and going further into showing you that you can be anyone. You don't have to be some great theologian or
Right.
something to share the gospel with people. Like you mentioned, Nabil Qureshi, throughout a series of 5 years while he was in medical school,
Right.
correct?
Well,
He
yeah, undergraduate too.
undergraduate
Yeah.
to become a Christian. Lee Strobel. Lee Strobel was an atheist
good one.
investigative journalist from the Chicago Tribune and the Daily Herald. And he used his profession to try to disprove God and ended up becoming a Christian.
Great story.
J. Warner Wallace, he was an atheist homicide detective from LA who tried to use his skills as a detective to disprove Christ, and he ended up becoming a Christian. James Tour, the synthetic organic chemist and nanotechnologist, he ended up becoming a Christian similar way. And Josh McDowell,
Yes.
he was a criminal defense attorney and tried to use his law and legal skills to disprove Christ, but ended up becoming a Christian.
Yeah.
So it doesn't matter who you are. The evidence is out there
Yeah.
for the reasons that we believe. And we encourage you to continue to do the research and do it in love and to share in love.
Yeah, that's great. Well, we appreciate you joining us. You know, the next 2 weeks, I've got a friend coming down from the International Mission Board, and we're going to talk about some practical ideas and ways how you can share your story, how you can use storying of the Bible and things like that. Did you know people remember stories, Jonathan, 24 times more than they remember the facts you tell them? And so we're
That's a
going to
fact.
teach you how to story and how to practically use storying to talk to someone, because Jesus used parables, he used stories and things like that. And so for the next 2 times, we're going to have some practical lessons and go from there. So we're going to have links for the books that he talked about, the websites I have. We'll have those in the YouTube in the bottom section. So guys, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See ya.